South Carolina Lowcountry, March 1971. A dirt road cuts through miles of marsh grass, red as a wound under the afternoon sun. Spanish moss hangs from live oaks like curtains no one has opened in years. Nothing moves except the tide creeping through the cordgrass in silver threads, slow and silent. A woman walks barefoot down that road, a baby pressed against her chest, a girl limping beside her, a boy carrying his sister on his back. There is blood drying on the woman's lip, a handprint still red on her left cheek. She does not look back. But the boy does. His eyes find something in the shadow beneath the old oak near the gate they just left. A figure, standing still, watching. Behind them the house they were thrown out of 20 minutes ago. Ahead, a mansion on a hill that should be empty, should be abandoned, should be nothing. Except someone inside has been waiting for 48 years. What would you do if on the same day you were thrown out of your own home with 3 hungry children, you realize someone was following you? If every step you took along that red clay road through the low country, every desperate glance you cast over your shoulder, revealed a shadow that should not have been there? And what if that shadow was not just another threat in a life already shattered, but the key to a secret so explosive it would turn your misery into something far greater? Rosalind Pemberton had 3 children, $4.75 crumpled in her apron pocket, and absolutely nothing else in the world when her brothers-in-law threw her out of the only home she had ever known. What she did not know, what she could not possibly have known, as she walked barefoot down that dirt road with a feverish baby in her arms, was that she was not walking toward ruin. She was walking toward an inheritance that had been stolen before she was born, protected by a woman she had never met and buried in the very water that had taken her husband's life. If stories like this one stay with you, take a moment now and subscribe to this channel. It is free, it takes 1 second, and it means you will not miss what happens next. Because what Rosalind Pemberton discovered in that abandoned house on the hill above the marsh changed far more than her circumstances. It changed the truth about every generation that came before her. The morning had begun the way every morning had begun for the past 9 months since Nate died. Rosalind woke on the thin mattress laid across the kitchen floor, the only place Boone and Cyrus still allowed her to sleep, and felt the ache in her spine before she felt anything else. Not a sharp pain, something deeper than that. The kind of pain that settles into bone when a body has spent 270 nights on cold tile with nothing between skin and ceramic but a folded sheet. Gray light filtered through the cracked window above the sink. The smell of dew and pluff mud drifted in from the marsh, mixing with the stale air of a kitchen that had not produced a real meal in weeks. The cast-iron stove against the far wall sat cold and unused. The pantry door hung open, showing bare shelves where spiders had long since taken up residence, spinning webs across spaces that Nate used to keep stocked with rice and dried beans and canned peaches from the orchard. Amos was pressed against her chest. 2 years old and light as paper, his breathing came fast and shallow, the way it always did now. And when Rosalind touched his forehead, the heat was there again, that low, persistent fever that never quite left, never quite spiked high enough to justify the panic she felt every time she checked. The nurse at the county clinic had used one word 3 weeks ago, when Rosalind still had enough coins for a visit. Malnourished. The boy needed milk, eggs, meat. Things that cost money Rosalind did not have. She rose carefully, lifting Amos against her shoulder, and crossed the kitchen in bare feet. The water from the faucet ran brown for several seconds before clearing to something almost transparent. She filled a tin cup and drank. The water tasted of rust and limestone, but it was wet, and that was enough. That was when she heard them. The voices came from the front room, where Boone and Cyrus took their coffee every morning at the long table that had belonged to their father and their father's father before that. Low voices, urgent. The kind of voices that press themselves flat against walls and try not to be heard. Rosalind set the cup down without a sound and moved to the door, which stood open just enough to let a sliver of light and a column of words slip through. "Has to be today." Boone's voice was a rough whisper, scraped raw by something that sounded almost like fear. "She cannot stay another night." "But where does she go?" Cyrus, always hesitant, always the younger brother trailing behind. "She has no one, Boone, no family, no money. She has nothing." A fist hit the table, cups rattled against wood. "Not our problem. You don't understand what's happening. Yesterday that old woman came around asking questions, asking about the creek, about the night Nate died, about the Beaumont family." Rosalind's breath stopped. Beaumont. The name moved through her like a current, not recognition exactly, but something adjacent to it. A vibration in a frequency she could almost hear. "The old woman doesn't know anything," Cyrus again trying to smooth what could not be smoothed. "Just stories. Just old Lowcountry talk. Stories that make people ask questions." The chair scraped. Boone was standing now. "And what happens when Rosalind starts asking, what happens if she finds her way to that house on the hill, the one that crazy Odessa woman told her she ought to visit? Rosalind does not even know the house exists." "We cannot take that chance." Boone's voice carried the weight of a door closing. "Today, she leaves today. Pack her things, put them on the road, and tell her we don't want a widow's curse hanging over this family anymore. Tell her she brought Nate's death on all of us. Tell her anything, but get her out before she starts asking questions she has no business asking." Rosalind pulled back from the door. Her hands were shaking so badly, the cup nearly slipped from her fingers. She set it on the counter with exaggerated care, metal touching ceramic with a sound no louder than a breath. They were going to throw her out today. But why now? What did the Beaumont name have to do with anything? And who was Odessa? She returned to the mattress and sat pulling Amos closer. Through the window she could see Judah and Wren in the yard. Her son was teaching his sister to skip stones across a puddle left by last night's rain. The girl's laughter, high and bright and entirely wrong for a house where laughter had not lived in months, carried through the broken glass like something precious that did not know it was about to be taken away. Rosalind closed her eyes. "Lord," she whispered, and the words came out cracked at every edge. "I know you have a plan. I know you have not forgotten us. But please, please show me what to do. My children are hungry. My children are afraid. And I do not know how to keep them safe anymore." The answer did not come in words. It came as a sound. The kitchen door slammed open, and Boone filled the frame shoulders. Wide hands like shovels, 3 days of stubble covering a jaw that seemed built for the sole purpose of clenching. His eyes found Rosalind on the mattress and stayed there with an expression that made her stomach fold in on itself. "Get up, pack your things. You and those children are leaving, now." She looked at him and said nothing for a long moment, giving herself the seconds she needed to make her voice sound steady when everything inside her was collapsing. The room smelled of old sweat, cheap whiskey, and the particular sourness of a man who believed cruelty was the same thing as strength. "Why, you heard me." 2 steps forward, he filled the kitchen the way a storm fills a room, all pressure and no air. 9 months, Rosalind. 9 months of you and those kids eating our food, drinking our water, sleeping on our floor. This was Nate's house, and Nate is dead. The house goes to family. To me and Cyrus, not to you. I am his widow. I have rights." Rights. He bent until his face was level with hers. She could see the red veins threading through the whites of his eyes, could smell the morning's bourbon still sour on his breath. "You have no rights. A widow brings death into a house. Everyone in Beaufort County knows it. Since Nate drowned, nothing has gone right. The shrimp boat's coming back empty. The oyster bed's drying up. Even the tides seem wrong. And you know why? Because you brought it. You brought death into this family. And now you need to take it somewhere else." The words landed like blows, each one precise and deliberate. But beneath the fear and the pain, something else was moving in Rosalind. Anger. 9 months of anger fed on every denied plate of food every night, on the cold floor, every time Boone looked at her children like they were stray dogs. Someone had forgotten to chase off the property. Nate did not die because of me. The slap caught the left side of her face with enough force to spin her head sideways. Stars, white and sharp, burst behind her eyes. Amos began to scream. Rosalind pulled him tight against her chest, shielding him with her body, tasting blood where her lip had split against her teeth. "Do not finish that sentence." Boone's voice had gone quiet now, which was worse than the shouting. "Do not talk about my brother. Do not talk about how he died. Do not talk about anything. Just pack and leave." Rosalind looked at him through the tears blurring her vision. Her cheek burned. Her ear rang with a high, thin sound, but behind all of it something inside her broke. Not her will, not her strength, but the last thread of hope that these men might still contain some small usable piece of decency. All right. She wiped the blood from her lip with the back of her hand. We will go. But let me gather our things. Let me take my children. 15 minutes. After that, whatever is still here goes in the burn pile. He left. The door shuddered in its frame. Rosalind moved through the next 14 minutes like a woman under water, slow, deliberate, every motion costing more effort than it should. She pulled open the drawer beneath the sink and retrieved the few things she had managed to keep. A wedding photograph, yellowed and creased, but still showing two young people who believed the world would be kind to them. Nate in a borrowed suit, Rosalind in a dress his mother had sewn, both smiling. God, how young they were, how sure. She wrapped the photograph in a scrap of cloth and placed it in a canvas sack. Then the small wooden box, birth certificates, Nate's death certificate, his wedding ring, a thin silver band that had belonged to his grandfather. She had tried to sell it twice in the past months, but could never bring herself to let it go. It was the last physical piece of Nate she had left. Clothes. The children needed clothes. She gathered what she could, Judah's patch trousers, 2 dresses for Wren that were already too small, Amos's 2 changes of clothing, 2 thin sheets from the floor mattress, Nate's Bible from the high shelf, heavy and old with notes in the margins, written by his grandmother in a hand so careful it looked like calligraphy. She could not leave the word behind. Whatever else happened, they would need it. Food. There had to be food somewhere. She tore through the empty pantry and found on the bottom shelf behind a jar of dust a half sleeve of saltine crackers gone soft with age. She took them. A tin cup, a bowl, a spoon. That was everything. She stepped into the yard. Judah and Wren had stopped playing. They stood watching Boone and Cyrus, who waited by the gate with arms crossed and faces that dared her to argue. Judah turned when he heard his mother's footsteps. His eyes found the red mark on her cheek, the swollen lip, and something moved across his face that no 13-year-old boy should ever have to feel. "What did he do to you?" He started toward Boone, fists clenched, and Rosalind caught his arm before he could take 3 steps. "No, it will not help. He hit you." The words came out like stones thrown hard at glass. "And if you go after him, he will hit you too, or worse." She knelt, ignoring the pain in her knees, and held her son's face between her hands. "Look at me. We are leaving. We are going to be fine. But I need you to be strong. I need you to help me with your sister. Can you do that?" Judah held her eyes for a long moment. Then a single nod, hard-controlled, carrying the weight of every year he had been forced to grow up too fast. "Wren." Rosalind held out her hand. "Come, sweetheart." The girl ran to her and seized her fingers with a grip that was all desperation and no strength. Her eyes were enormous, her bottom lip trembling like a leaf in a wind she could not see. "Where are we going, Mama?" "I do not know yet, because she was done lying to her daughter, but we are going together, and as long as we are together, everything is all right." They walked to the gate. Cyrus would not meet her eyes. He stared at the ground, hands in his pockets, guilt written across every line of his face, but he said nothing. He never said anything. He was the kind of coward who let his older brother do the ugly work and then washed his hands afterward. Boone reached into his pocket and held out a few crumpled bills. $4.75. That is everything Nate had left. Do not come back. Do not send word. Do not speak our name. As far as anyone is concerned, you are no longer family. Rosalind took the money with fingers that would not stop trembling. $4.75. Enough to feed her children for 2 days, maybe 3, if she found day-old bread at a price even lower than her pride. You will regret this. The words left her mouth before she could stop them. Someday you will understand what you have done, and you will regret it. Boone laughed, a sound with no humor in it at all. Threats from a desperate widow do not scare me. Now get off my property before I call the sheriff for trespassing. She turned without another word, held Wren's hand, adjusted Amos on her left hip. The sacks hung from her right shoulder, pulling at muscles that had nothing left to give. Judah walked at her side, his presence small but solid, and they began to walk. The road was red clay, rutted deep by truck tires, baking under a March sun that had forgotten the meaning of mercy. Rosalind felt the sweat begin immediately, rivulets down her back, pasting the thin cotton dress to her skin. Her bare feet raised small clouds of rust-colored dust with every step. She did not look back. She could not look back, because if she did, she might see the porch where Nate used to sit in the evenings with a glass of sweet tea, watching the egrets cross the sky in long white lines. If she looked back, she might break entirely. It was Judah who noticed first. "Mama," a tug at her sleeve. "Someone is behind us." Rosalind stopped, turned slowly. The road stretched empty behind them. Marsh grass on both sides, a few live oaks, trailing curtains of Spanish moss. Nothing else. "There is no one, sweetheart." I saw her. There was a certainty in his voice that raised the hair on Rosalind's arms when we left the gate. A woman old, standing in the shadow of the big oak, just watching. Rosalind looked again. Nothing, no one. "It was your imagination. It was not imagination, Mama." Judah looked at her with eyes that had seen too much for 13 years on this earth. "Someone was there, and I think she is following us." A chill moved through Rosalind despite the suffocating heat. But what could she do? They could not go back. They could not stop. "Then we walk faster." That was all she said, and they did. They walked for hours. The sun climbed, peaked, and began its slow descent, painting the Lowcountry in shades of amber and gold that would have been beautiful if Rosalind had the capacity to notice beauty. She did not. She was focused entirely on placing one foot in front of the other, left, right, while her arms burned under the weight of Amos and the sacks, while her feet left bloody prints on the clay. Wren began limping after the first hour. Her small feet, unaccustomed to distance, found every sharp stone the road had to offer. Rosalind saw the moment the girl stepped on something that cut the tiny gasp, the flash of surprise, but Wren did not complain. She simply kept walking, her hand gripping Rosalind's, leaving small smears of red in the dust with every step. "Mama," the small voice finally broke. "My foot hurts." Rosalind knelt and examined the cut, not deep, but bleeding. She tore a strip from the hem of her own dress, the fabric so thin it barely held together, and wrapped it around Wren's foot with hands that shook from exhaustion and rage and the impossible tenderness that motherhood demands even when there is nothing left. Judah was already kneeling, offering his back. "Get on, Wren, I have got you." "You are tired too," Rosalind began. "I can handle it." He was already lifting his sister, settling her weight across his narrow shoulders. Her thin arms wrapped around his neck. Her thin legs circled his waist. He staggered once, then steadied. "See easy." Rosalind's heart broke and filled with pride in the same breath. 13 years old, and her son was already carrying the family on his back. It was nearly dusk when she saw it. On a rise to the west, silhouetted against the sky that had turned the color of a bruise, purple and gold and streaked with the last light, a house. Not a house, a mansion. Even through the haze of exhaustion, Rosalind could see its scale. 2 stories of white clapboard, or what had once been white, now gray and peeling, a wide veranda supported by columns wrapped in wisteria gone wild, tall windows, many broken, catching the dying light like empty eyes, live oaks flanking the entrance, their branches heavy with Spanish moss that hung in long gray curtains, moving slowly in a breeze that did not seem to reach the road. Whitfield House. She did not know the name yet, she did not know anything about it yet, but something inside her pulled toward that house the way a compass needle pulls toward north. Not a thought, not a decision, but something older and deeper than either, looks haunted. Wren's voice trembled from Judah's back. "There is no such thing as haunted, sweetheart, just old and empty." But Rosalind was not sure. There was something about the house, something that raised the skin on her arms and tightened something low in her stomach. Still she looked at the sky. 30 minutes of light left, maybe less. 3 children, one of them sick, no shelter. "We are going up there," Mama Judah began. She was already walking. The path from the road to the house wound uphill through waist-high marsh grass that whispered against her legs as she passed. Every step revealed more of the house, and none of it was encouraging. The veranda had gaps where boards had rotted through. The front door, heavy cypress carved with a pattern of egrets and marsh reeds, stood slightly open, as though the house had been waiting. Rosalind climbed the steps, testing each board. The wood groaned, but held. She pushed the door. The hinges shrieked a long, high sound that echoed through empty rooms and came back, changed like a voice that had traveled a great distance. Inside a wide entrance hall, a chandelier overhead, half its crystals missing the rest, catching what little light remained and scattering it across walls stained with decades of damp. A staircase rising to the 2nd floor, its banister draped in cobwebs thick as lace. To the right, a parlour with furniture covered in white sheets, ghost shapes in the dimness. To the left a dining room, a long table still visible beneath its shroud of dust. And on the wall beside the cold fireplace in the entrance hall, hanging from a single iron nail, something caught what was left of the light and held it. A key, an iron skeleton key, black with age, heavy enough that the nail it hung from had pulled slightly away from the plaster over what must have been years, decades of patient, silent wait. Rosalind reached for it without thinking. Her fingers closed around cold metal, and something moved through her that she could not name. Not recognition, not memory, something more like the feeling of putting your hand on a door you have been meant to open your entire life without knowing it existed. She held the key for a long moment, then she placed it back on the nail carefully, the way you handle something whose purpose you do not yet understand, but suspect is important. They found a room at the back of the ground floor, a servant's quarter, from another century, small, with a window that still had glass and a door that still closed. The mattress on the narrow bed had gone to rot, but the floor was dry. Rosalind spread one sheet, laid Amos on it, covered him with the other, divided the stale crackers into 5 pieces, tried to coax Amos to eat. He turned his face away. Wren ate hers in 3 bites and looked at Rosalind with eyes that asked for more. There was no more. They slept in a pile, Wren against Rosalind's side, Amos on her chest, Judah with his back against the wall, keeping watch even in his dreams. It was near midnight when Rosalind heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Someone moving through the house with the care of a person who knew exactly where every creaking board lay and how to avoid them, coming closer, stopping outside the door. Rosalind did not breathe. Every muscle locked. Her hand found the tin cup, the only thing within reach that could serve as a weapon, and she gripped it so hard the rim cut into her palm. Silence. Then a voice, a woman's voice, old and quiet, and carrying a weight of years that Rosalind could hear in every syllable. "You are where you need to be, child. Sleep now. We will talk in the morning." Footsteps retreating. A door closing somewhere far away in the house. Silence again, broken only by the sound of the marsh outside, the soft rhythmic breathing of water moving through grass, the tide doing what it had always done, what it would always do, going out, coming back, going out, coming back. Rosalind lay still for a long time listening. Eventually, exhaustion overwhelmed fear, and she slept. And when she slept, she dreamed of Nate. He was standing in the tidal creek behind the house, water up to his waist, holding something in his hands, something she could not quite see, and smiling at her, the way he used to smile when he knew something she did not, and was waiting for the right moment to tell her. The smell woke her. Not light, it was barely dawn, the sky still grey through the cracked window pane. The smell, coffee, rich and dark, and so real that for one disoriented moment Rosalind thought she was back in the kitchen on the Pemberton property, and Nate was alive, and none of the last 9 months had happened. But there was another smell beneath the coffee, bread, warm bread. She sat up fast, ignoring the explosion of pain in her neck and spine. The children were still asleep. Amos's breathing sounded easier this morning, slower, steadier. His skin, when she touched it, was cooler. Not well, but better. The smallest mercy, and she took it. She moved to the door, placed her hand on the knob, and hesitated. The voice from last night. The woman who had told her to sleep, who had known she was here, who had apparently spent the early morning making coffee and bread in a kitchen that yesterday had seemed abandoned for decades. She opened the door and followed the smell down the corridor. The house looked different in daylight, still ruined, still sad, but the morning light turned it from frightening to merely heartbreaking. Water stains on walls that had once been papered in pale blue, portraits in gilded frames, faces of men and women long dead, staring out with the stiff formality of another century. She stopped in the kitchen doorway. A woman stood with her back to Rosalind, stirring something on the cast-iron stove that yesterday had looked too rusted to function, but now had a fire burning inside it. She was small, slightly bent with age, wearing a grey cotton dress and a white apron tied at the waist. Her hair was white completely, purely white, pulled into a low knot at the back of her neck. Her hands visible as they moved, the spoon in slow circles, were mapped with veins and age spots, but they moved with the confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime feeding people. "Are you going to stand in that doorway, or are you going to come in and eat?" Rosalind stepped into the kitchen. "Who are you?" "My name is Odessa." The woman turned, and Rosalind saw a face so deeply lined it looked like a landscape, seen from the air, every crease a river, every fold a valley. But the eyes, dark brown, nearly black, were sharp and young and utterly alive. Odessa Vance. "And I know who you are, Rosalind Pemberton." "How do you know my name?" "I know a great many things." Odessa filled a cup with coffee from a battered percolator and held it out. "Sit, eat, then bring the children. They need food more than you do. After that, you and I are going to talk about things that should have been said a very long time ago." Rosalind took the cup. The heat burned her palms, but it was the good kind of burning, the kind that reminds you that your body is still capable of feeling something other than pain. She drank. The coffee was strong and bitter and unsweetened and perfect. "Why are you helping me?" The words came before she could hold them. "You do not know me. You have no reason to." "I have every reason." Odessa set a plate on the table, bread still warm, and a wedge of white cheese. "I knew people like you, good people, who suffered because other people decided that greed was worth more than human life." She paused, and something moved through her eyes, pain or regret, or both at once. "And I know you another way, too, through your great-grandmother." Rosalind blinked. "My great-grandmother, I never met her. She died before my mother was born." "I know. Lavinia Beaumont died in 1924, giving birth to your grandmother. But I knew her. I worked for the Beaumont family for 25 years in this house. Odessa gestured at the walls around them. This house was theirs, Whitfield House. 600 acres of Lowcountry marsh and farmland, from the river to the Sound. All of it Beaumont land. The name again, Beaumont. The same name Boone had spoken that morning. The name that seemed to carry weight and history, and something darker beneath both. I do not understand. What does my great-grandmother have to do with any of this, with this house, with me? Everything. Odessa sat down heavily across the table. Everything in the world, but it is a long story, and before I tell it, I need you to eat. I need you to get your strength back, because when you hear the truth, you're going to need every ounce of strength you can find. Rosalind ate. The bread was coarse and simple, but the taste of it, flour, water, salt, yeast, transformed by heat into something that could sustain life, exploded in her mouth like a revelation. She ate fast, unable to stop herself. The cheese followed. Then more coffee. She brought the children. Judah entered the kitchen with the wariness of a boy who had learned that the world does not give anything for free. Wren came holding her brother's hand, eyes wide, asking the only question that mattered. Is there food? Odessa had laid out more bread, more cheese, warm milk for the children, where the milk had come from. Rosalind could not imagine, but it was there white and real in tin cups, and Wren drank hers as though it were the most precious substance on earth. Amos managed a few bites of bread, softened in milk, not much, but something. Progress. When the children had finished, Odessa spoke again. Judah. At the end of the hall there is a room with old books in it, adventure stories. Take your sister and brother. Stay there for an hour while I talk to your mother. Judah looked at Rosalind. She nodded. Go. I will be right here. When they were alone, Odessa poured 2 fresh cups of coffee and sat down with the heaviness of a woman about to lift something she had been carrying for nearly 50 years. Whitfield House was built in 1868 by Charles Beaumont. He made his fortune in rice and indigo after the war. Had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. The daughter was Lavinia, smartest of the 3, strongest of the 3, and more stubborn than a Lowcountry mule in August. A ghost of a smile crossed Odessa's lips. I loved her like she was my own. Lavinia married a man named Clement Marsh. Good man, honest man. They had a daughter, Eudora, your grandmother. But Lavinia's older brother Jasper was a drunk and a gambler, and he had a friend, a man named Horace Pemberton. The surname hit Rosalind like a physical blow. Pemberton. Like my husband. Like Boone and Cyrus. Exactly like. Horace Pemberton was the great-grandfather of Boone and Cyrus, and he was every bit as greedy as they are. Odessa closed her eyes as though the next part cost her something to say. In 1923, Jasper and Horace forged documents claiming Clement had gambling debts. Lies. Clement did not gamble, did not drink, would not have wagered a penny on a sure thing. They used the forged papers to seize the land. And when Clement tried to prove the documents were false, Odessa stopped. They killed him. Rosalind whispered it, feeling the blood leave her face. They drowned him in the creek, the same way they killed Nate. Odessa opened her eyes, and they were bright with tears, held back for half a century. They held him under the water at low tide and called it an accident. I saw it. I saw Horace and two hired men holding Clement down while he fought. I saw, and I did nothing, because I was 20 years old and terrified, and they told me that if I opened my mouth they would do the same to me and to Lavinia and to baby Eudora. The kitchen seemed to tilt. Rosalind gripped the edge of the table. Lavinia went nearly mad with grief. She tried to fight, tried to prove Clement was murdered. But Jasper and Horace had bought the sheriff, the judge, everyone. They took the land, threw Lavinia and Eudora out with nothing. What happened to them? Lavinia disappeared, took Eudora, and vanished. Years later I heard she had died, that Eudora had married, changed her name, tried to forget everything connected to Beaumont. But before Lavinia left, Odessa reached into her apron pocket and produced an iron key on a leather cord. She told me something. Rosalind stared at the key. It was identical to the one hanging on the nail by the fireplace in the entrance hall. The same black iron, the same weight, the same age. She said, "Odessa, the truth is buried here. The real documents, the proof that this land is mine. It is hidden where only the tide knows. One day, someone will come looking, and when they find it, justice will be done." Nate found it. Rosalind's voice was barely audible now. Nate discovered the truth, and they killed him for it. He came to me 3 months before he died. He had been researching the family history, found old records that did not match discrepancies in the land titles going back to 1923. He asked me if I knew anything, and I told him everything. And I gave him this. Odessa held up the key. Its twin is on the nail where Lavinia left it, the night she hid the documents. This one she gave to me. She made me swear I would keep it until the right person came. Rosalind could not move, could not breathe. 9 months of grief and confusion and unanswered questions were rearranging themselves into a shape she could finally see, and the shape was monstrous. Where are the documents? Read the diaries first. Odessa pointed toward the ceiling, the attic. 40 years of Lavinia's life written in her own hand. The answer is there in her words. I have read them all, searching, but I could never fully piece together the clues. She paused. Perhaps you can. You are her blood, after all. Rosalind was already moving toward the door when Odessa's voice stopped her. Rosalind, be prepared. When Boone and Cyrus find out you are here, and they will find out, they will come. And they will not come to talk. Rosalind paused in the doorway and looked back. Her eyes were dry now. The tears had burned away, replaced by something harder, something that had been forged in 9 months of loss and humiliation, and was only now finding its true shape. Then let them come. Let them try to throw me out of this house, the way they threw me out of theirs, because this time I am not leaving quietly. This time I am going to fight. and I am going to expose every lie this family has built on my husband's blood and my great-grandmother's bones." She climbed the stairs 2 at a time, her bare feet striking the old wood like a heartbeat accelerating. Behind her, Odessa stood alone in the kitchen, her hand still holding the iron key, its twin hanging silently on the nail 1 room away, 2 halves of a lock that had waited 48 years to be turned. She found the attic. She found the diaries, dozens of them, leather-bound, arranged chronologically on a mahogany desk that still held the ghost of Lavinia's presence. She opened the last volume, dated 1923, and turned to the final entry. "They drowned my Clement. They held him in the creek at low tide and called it God's will. But I know the truth, and I have buried it where the water breathes, where the tide goes out and comes back, goes out and comes back, patient and endless and impossible to stop. The key opens what the water guards, and when someone finally finds it, let the reckoning rise the way the tide rises, slow and sure and impossible to hold back." Rosalind's hands were shaking so hard the diary nearly slipped from her fingers. Tears ran freely now, not of grief, but of recognition. Her own great-grandmother had endured the same betrayal, the same loss, the same injustice, and she had hidden the proof in the one place the Pembertons would never think to look, in the very water they had used as a weapon. The documents were in the tidal creek, somewhere beneath the surface, sealed in iron, waiting for the tide to turn. And somewhere in the house below her, Rosalind could hear Amos laughing at something Wren had said, a sound so small and so ordinary and so unbearably precious that it reminded her exactly why she was going to do what came next, no matter what it cost. Rosalind spent 3 days in the attic of Whitfield House. She read until her eyes ached, until the afternoon light shifted from gold to amber to the deep bruised purple of evening, until Odessa came up the narrow stairs with a candle and a plate of food and told her the children were asking for her. Then she went down, held them, put them to sleep, and climbed back up again. The diary spanned 43 years from Lavinia's 12th birthday in 1880 to her final entry in 1923. Rosalind did not read them in order. She could not afford that luxury. Instead, she worked backward from the last entry, the one that had cracked her open the first night, tracing the references to the creek, to the forged documents, to the names of men who had conspired to steal everything her great-grandmother had. She organized what she found on the old desk in stacks. Letters between Jasper Beaumont and Horace Pemberton, casual at first, then increasingly transactional, like men discussing the purchase of livestock rather than the destruction of a family. A hand-drawn map of the property, boundaries, Lavinia's careful ink, marking the tidal creek where the original deed lay hidden. Photographs, their edges curled with age. One in particular stopped Rosalind cold. 3 men standing together near the water. Clement Beaumont, tall and gentle-eyed. Jasper, his own brother, short and thick, and wearing an expression of permanent dissatisfaction. and Horace Pemberton large, and calculating his hand resting on Clement's shoulder in a gesture that looked friendly until you noticed how the fingers pressed into the fabric. Possessive, predatory. Odessa appeared at her elbow. Lavinia took that photograph 2 weeks before Clement died. She told me later that something about that day frightened her, the way Jasper and Horace whispered when they thought no one was listening. Rosalind placed the photograph carefully in the wooden box she had designated for evidence. She needed more. The diaries proved the theft. The photograph proved the relationships. Odessa's testimony proved the murder of Clement, but none of it connected directly to Nate. None of it proved what Boone and Cyrus had done 9 months ago in the same creek where their great-grandfather had held another man beneath the water 50 years before. I need to find the person who discovered Nate's body. His name is Nolan Sykes. Odessa was already nodding as though she had been waiting for Rosalind to arrive at this conclusion on her own. Young man, mid-20s. Worked the Pemberton fields until right after Nate died. Quit without explanation. Lives alone now in the old Cooper's cottage near Chowan Creek. Rosalind left Judah in charge, the instruction unnecessary. By now, the boy having already assumed a role no child should carry, and walked the 3 miles to the village of Sheldon Bluff. The road followed the edge of the marsh, and the tide was coming in the water, creeping through the grass, in silver fingers, filling the low places with a patience that seemed almost deliberate, as though the marsh had all the time in the world, and knew it. The village was small, 1 paved road, a general store with a sagging porch, a white clapboard church, a handful of houses scattered along the bluff above the river. Rosalind had been here only a few times during the years she lived with Nate, and she had never felt welcome the outsider who married a Pemberton, but would never truly be one. Now walking down the main road under a sky so blue it hurt to look at, she felt the stares. Women pausing mid-sweep on their porches, a man in the doorway of the store turning his head to watch her pass. Everyone knew. Everyone had heard about the widow thrown out with her children, and now they were wondering why she had come back. She went directly to the store. The woman behind the counter, heavy-set with kind eyes and hands that never stopped moving, looked up from a crate of canned goods. Mrs. Hathaway. Rosalind did not have time for pleasantries. "I'm looking for Nolan Sykes. Do you know where I can find him?" The woman's expression cycled through surprise, discomfort, and something that might have been sympathy before settling into caution. "Why would you want to find him?" "Because he found my husband the night he died, and I need to ask him what he saw." Mrs. Hathaway studied Rosalind's face for a long moment, then glanced at the door, as though checking whether the walls had ears. "Rosalind, do not get involved in this. The Pembertons are dangerous. Everyone in this county knows it, but I am already involved." Rosalind leaned forward, palms flat on the counter. "I know what they did. Not just to Nate. I know about Clement Beaumont. I know about the stolen land. I know that the Pemberton fortune was built on murder and forged documents, and I am going to prove every bit of it. But I need witnesses. I need Nolan. Mrs. Hathaway exhaled slowly. The Cooper's cottage, past the church, follow the creek path until you reach the big magnolia. The cottage is behind it, mostly hidden. He does not come into town anymore, does not talk to anyone. Whatever he saw that night broke something in him. The cottage sat in the shadow of the magnolia, half swallowed by oleander that had been left to grow unchecked. Rosalind knocked, no answer, knocked again harder. Nolan Sykes, my name is Rosalind Pemberton. I need to talk to you about my husband. Go away. The voice from inside was young, but hollowed out like a bell that had been struck too hard and lost its tone. Already told the sheriff. Already told the Pembertons. It was an accident. It was not an accident. And you know it. Silence. Then the sound of a bolt sliding. The door opened enough to reveal one dark eye examining her through the gap. How do you know that? Because my husband was careful. Because he had no reason to be at the creek that night unless someone brought him there. And because I know the Pembertons have been drowning men who ask the wrong questions for 50 years. The eye studied her. Then the door opened fully. Nolan Sykes was thin and tall, with skin burned dark by years of field work and hands that could not stop moving, fingers twisting the hem of his shirt, tapping against his thigh, reaching for things that were not there. But it was his eyes that told Rosalind everything she needed to know. They were the eyes of someone who had seen a thing he could not unsee and had been living inside that, seeing ever since. Come in, quick, before someone notices. The cottage was one room, bed, chair, stove, a few shelves, but clean. The refuge of a man with little who took care of what he had. Nolan closed the door and locked it, then stood with his back against it, as though the wood itself could keep out what he was afraid of. You saw it. Rosalind did not frame it as a question. Nolan closed his eyes. A muscle jumped in his jaw. I knew, God forgive me, I knew it was not an accident, and I said nothing. Then tell me now. He moved to the chair and sat as though his legs had given a final notice. His face dropped into his hands, and when the words came, they came in the cadence of something rehearsed 1,000 times in the dark. It was after 10. I was coming back from the south field, forgot my tools. I saw lanterns near the creek. No one should have been there that time of night, so I went closer, heard voices, recognized Nate's and Boone's. They were arguing about documents, papers. Nate had found old records that proved the land had been taken from the Beaumont family. Nate was saying he was going to the authorities, that he had proof the entire Pemberton claim was built on forgery and blood. What did Boone say? That Nate did not understand, that he was going to ruin everything. Nolan's hands were trembling now, pressed hard against his face, as though trying to hold something inside. And then Boone pushed him. Nate stumbled backward toward the water, and Cyrus kicked his legs out from under him. Nate went into the creek. Rosalind felt the room contract. She had known in her body for 9 months, but hearing it the specific, terrible mechanics of how her husband was taken from her. He tried to swim. Nolan's voice fractured, but Boone grabbed one of the tide measuring poles and held him under. I could see Nate fighting. I could see the water moving where his hands were trying to reach the surface. And Boone just held that pole steady, like he was doing a job, like it was work. And Cyrus, Nolan lifted his face. His eyes were wet. That is the thing. Cyrus did not help hold the pole. He stood there, frozen, I think. And then before Nate stopped moving, Cyrus turned his back, walked away. I heard his boots on the clay walking fast, like he could not get away quick enough. He could not watch the end of it. Something turned in Rosalind's mind. Not forgiveness, nothing close to forgiveness, but a piece of information that changed the shape of what she was looking at. Cyrus had not held the pole. Cyrus had turned away. Why did you not tell anyone? Because Boone came to me the next morning. Nolan's voice climbed with the old fear. He told me he knew I had been near the creek. He said, if I opened my mouth about anything, I had or had not seen my wife and my 2 boys would have an accident, a bad one. And I believed him, because I had just watched him hold a man underwater until the bubbles stopped. Rosalind knelt in front of him and took his shaking hands between her own. Will you testify? Will you tell the police what you saw? They will kill me. They will kill my family. Not if we go together. Not if we bring everything at once. 50 years of evidence, documents, diaries, your testimony, so overwhelming that they cannot react before the truth is out. And if it does not work, then at least we tried. At least we gave Nate the truth he deserved. Nolan looked at her for a long time, the war inside him visible in every line of his face, the pull of fear against the weight of conscience, the instinct to protect his family against the need to stop carrying the thing he had seen. I will testify, but only if we go together to the state police, not the county sheriff. Boone owns the sheriff. The state police with everything all at once, I promise. She walked back to Whitfield House through the late afternoon, and for the first time in 9 months, something moved inside her chest that she had forgotten the shape of. Hope. Small, fragile, uncertain, but alive. She did not know that one of Boone's hired men had been sitting on the porch of the general store when she entered, had watched her walk toward the creek path, had followed at a distance, and seen her enter Nolan's cottage, and had already driven to the Pemberton house to report what he had seen. On the porch of Whitfield House, she found something that had not been there when she left. A crate wooden with no note, no name, no indication of who had brought it. Inside a dozen eggs, a quart of milk, a loaf of bread, a jar of peach preserves, and folded at the bottom a child's sweater, hand-knitted in a shade of blue that matched Wren's eyes. Someone in Sheldon Bluff had been watching, had understood, and had chosen to help without the complication of being seen doing it. Rosalind pressed the sweater against her face and breathed in the smell of clean wool and someone else's kindness. The next morning she climbed to the attic at dawn and froze in the doorway. The desk had been overturned, papers scattered across the floor like leaves blown by a wind that had no business being inside a house. The carefully organized stacks gone. Rosalind dropped to her knees and began sorting through the chaos, her hands moving faster and faster as the understanding formed. Someone had been here during the night. Someone had climbed through one of the broken windows on the second floor and come up to the attic while she and the children slept one floor below. 2 diaries were missing. She checked 3 times, counting the spines against the dates she had memorized. 1895 through 1922, all present. But 1923 and the unnumbered volume that contained Lavinia's map of the creek, her instructions for finding the iron chest, her genealogy tracing the bloodline from Beaumont to Rosalind, gone. The 2 volumes that contained everything. She sat on the floor surrounded by scattered papers, and for the first time since Boone's hand had connected with her face in the kitchen 4 days ago, she felt the ground give way beneath her. Without those diaries, the case was weakened. The specific locations, the genealogical proof, the detailed account of Clement's murder in Lavinia's own handwriting, all of it in Boone's hands now, probably already burning in the fireplace of the Pemberton house. The sound of footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate, familiar. He took them. Rosalind did not look up. Boone was here during the night, and he took the 2 diaries that mattered most. Odessa appeared in the doorway, looked at the ransacked attic, and said nothing for several seconds. Then she reached beneath the collar of her dress and drew out the leather cord that held the iron key, and beside the key something Rosalind had not noticed before, a smaller key, brass tarnished, nearly black. You think I waited 48 years and left the proof where anyone with a window and a grudge could take it? Rosalind looked up. I have spent 20 years in this attic, child, 20 years reading those diaries, copying them, making certain that if anything happened to the originals, the truth would still exist. Odessa held up the brass key. Every page of every diary photographed. 96 rolls of film developed and stored in the basement of Reverend Gaines' church behind a wall that has not been opened since 1951. She crossed the attic and stood over Rosalind, and her voice carried an authority that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her small bent frame. Boone Pemberton can burn every diary in this house. He can tear Whitfield House to the ground and salt the earth where it stood. And it will not matter, because I have copies of everything, and they are in the one place in Sheldon Bluff that even Boone would not dare violate. Rosalind stared at the old woman and felt something shift the ground, settling back beneath her feet. Firmer now than before, because the setback had revealed something more valuable than the diaries themselves. It had revealed the depth of Odessa's preparation, the decades-long architecture of a woman who had never stopped building the case, even when she believed no one would ever come to finish it. They spent the morning reorganizing what remained. Odessa retrieved the photographic copies from the church thick envelopes of black and white prints, each page of each diary reproduced with care that bordered on devotion. They spread them across the parlor floor and began assembling the complete record, the original documents that remained the photographic copies of what Boone had taken, the letters, the photographs, Nolan's promised testimony. For the first time, Rosalind could see the full shape of the case, and it was devastating. They were still working when Judah appeared in the parlor doorway with an expression that emptied Rosalind's lungs. "Mama, there are trucks coming up the road." Rosalind was at the front window before the boy finished speaking. Two vehicles, Boone's black pickup and a flatbed she did not recognize, grinding up the hill, raising dust that hung in the still air like smoke. How many Judah had already counted? 4 men, Boone, Cyrus, and 2 others. Odessa began gathering the documents from the floor with a speed that contradicted her years. Everything into the box. Now, whatever happens, the evidence stays together. They had the box sealed and pushed beneath the loose floorboard in the servants' quarter, the same room where Rosalind had spent her first night when the front door crashed open hard enough to knock the remaining crystals from the chandelier. Glass shattered on the marble floor, the sound sharp and final, like the last pretense of civility breaking apart. "Where is she?" Boone's voice filled the house the way floodwater fills a basement, rising unstoppable, seeking every corner. "I know she is here, old woman. I saw the children through the window." Rosalind came down the stairs with the iron candlestick from the mantelpiece in her right hand. She had not made a conscious decision to pick it up. It had simply been there, and her hand had simply closed around it, the way a hand closes around the handle of a tool it has always known how to use. Boone stood in the entrance hall with Cyrus behind him, and 2 men she did not recognize flanking the door, large blank-faced, hired for their size and their willingness to do what they were told. Boone's eyes found Rosalind on the stairs, and what she saw in them was not rage. It was something colder, calculation. The arithmetic of a man deciding exactly how much violence the situation required. "Give me the documents, Rosalind. Whatever you have found, whatever the old woman has shown you, give it to me, and take your children and walk away. I will let you leave. You can go anywhere you want. Just give me what is mine. Nothing in this house is yours." Rosalind descended the final step and placed herself between Boone and the corridor where her children were hidden. "Nothing on this land is yours. It never was. You do not know what you are talking about. I know everything about Lavinia Beaumont, about Clement, about how Horace Pemberton and Jasper Beaumont forged documents and drowned a man and stole 600 acres from a widow and her infant daughter. And I know," her voice dropped to something low and controlled and more dangerous than shouting, "that you did exactly the same thing to Nate, that you held him under the water with a tide pole while he fought to breathe, that Cyrus stood and watched, and that Nolan Sykes saw everything." The silence that followed pressed against the walls. Cyrus behind Boone had gone the color of old ash. His mouth opened, then closed. His eyes moved to the floor, to the ceiling, to anywhere that was not Rosalind's face. Boone moved fast. 2 strides and his hand was around Rosalind's throat, thick fingers closing on her windpipe lifting her until her toes barely touched the floor. The candlestick dropped from her grip and rang against the marble. Amos began screaming from somewhere in the back of the house, the sound thin and terrified, the sound of a child who cannot see what is happening, but can feel the wrongness of it through walls. Then you are never going to have the chance to tell anyone. Stars burst behind Rosalind's eyes, the edges of her vision darkened. She clawed at Boone's wrists, but the hands were iron immovable, squeezing with the patient certainty of a man who had done this before. The crack of bronze against skull was loud enough to echo. Boone released her, instantly staggering sideways, blood sheeting from a gash above his right ear. Judah stood behind him, the fallen candlestick in both hands, gripping it the way a batter grips a Louisville slugger, his face showing nothing, no fear, no hesitation, just the flat-eyed focus of someone defending the only thing that matters. Do not touch my mother. Boone touched the side of his head, looked at the blood on his fingers, then looked at the boy. Something terrible gathered in his expression, a fury so large it needed a moment to find its shape, but before it could land, a voice cut through the house with the force of a church bell struck at close range. "There is enough." Odessa stood in the front doorway, and she was not alone. 3 men flanked her neighbors from the surrounding farms, men whose names Rosalind did not know, but whose faces she recognized from the village. One held a mattock, one held a pitchfork, the third held a hatchet with a handle worn smooth by years of use. They did not look angry. They looked decided, which was worse. "You are leaving now, Boone?" Odessa's voice carried a command that had nothing to do with volume. "Both of you, before these men decide that what you just did to that woman in front of her children is reason enough to do something they will have to confess to Reverend Gaines on Sunday." Boone scanned the room, the math again, always the math. 2 Pembertons and 2 hired men against 4 men with tools, and a woman whose fury had 50 years of fuel behind it. Not favorable odds, not in daylight, not with witnesses. This is not finished. He pointed at Rosalind, who was on her knees, one hand on her bruised throat, the other reaching for Judah. "I am going to find out exactly what you think you know, and I'm going to make sure you never share it with anyone." Cyrus had not moved during the entire confrontation. He stood exactly where he had been standing when Boone's hand closed around Rosalind's neck, frozen his face, a mask of something that was not quite guilt and not quite horror, but contained elements of both, like a man watching a building collapse and realizing he helped pour the foundation. As Boone turned to leave, Rosalind saw Cyrus's eyes meet hers for exactly 1 second. In that second, something passed between them that neither could have articulated an acknowledgment, perhaps that they were both trapped inside a story written by men who were dead, and that the ending had not yet been decided. Then Cyrus looked away and followed his brother out the door. Nate had known. That was the part Rosalind could not stop thinking about, as Odessa pressed a cold cloth against her bruised throat, and Judah stood guard at the window, watching the trucks disappear down the hill. Nate had known about the Beaumont connection for months before he died. He had researched it, found the discrepancies, sought out Odessa, listened to her story, and then he had gone to Boone. Not to the police, not to a lawyer, to Boone, because that was who Nate was. He believed in family, believed that even a man like Boone could be reached, could be reasoned with, could be shown the truth and choose to do the right thing. She could see it now, not a memory, because she had not been there, but something built from everything she knew about her husband and the way he moved through the world. Nate standing at the edge of the creek in the dark, holding the copied deed, saying the words he had rehearsed. Boone, I found the original land grant. This property belongs to the Beaumont family. It always has. We need to make this right. And Boone's answer, not words but a push, a kick, a pull, held steady against the current, while the tide did the rest. Odessa sat across from Rosalind in the kitchen, the iron key resting on the table between them like a compass, pointing toward a decision that could not be postponed. Tonight, Rosalind said, we go to the church tonight. We take everything, the box, the photographs, Nolan's written statement. We call the state police from Reverend Gaines's telephone, and we do not leave that church until someone with a badge and no connection to Boone Pemberton takes custody of every piece of evidence we have. Tonight is dangerous. Boone will be watching. Boone will be watching tomorrow too, and the day after. Rosalind's voice was hoarse from the bruising, but the words carried. Every day we wait is a day he uses to plan something worse. He already broke into this house and stole from us. He just tried to strangle me in front of my children. The next time he will not make the mistake of doing it where anyone can intervene. Odessa looked at her a long measuring look that seemed to take in not just Rosalind, but every woman in the line that connected Lavinia Beaumont to this moment. Then she nodded once. Then we go tonight. They waited until there was no moon. The cloud cover rolled in from the coast around 9 thick and low, swallowing the stars, and plunging the Lowcountry into a darkness so complete that Rosalind could not see her own hand in front of her face. She moved through the house by memory and by touch, gathering the children, whispering instructions, wrapping Amos in the knitted sweater from the anonymous crate because the night air of the marsh carried a chill that cut through cotton. Judah carried Wren without being asked. Odessa carried the evidence box, refusing help with a look that permitted no argument. Rosalind took Amos on her hip, and the iron key on its cord around her neck, tucked beneath her dress, where it lay cold against her sternum, heavy with the weight of what it would soon unlock. They made it through the back door and across 50 yards of grass before the flashlight beams found them. There, moving toward the creek path, the voice belonged to one of the hired men. Rosalind recognized the flat, indifferent tone of someone performing a task for money, not conviction. Run! Rosalind did not whisper it. The time for whispering was over. Run now. They ran. Odessa knew the marsh the way she knew her own heartbeat, every hummock, every drainage channel, every solid path through the cordgrass that would support weight, and every soft spot that would swallow a boot to the ankle. She led them through the dark like a woman following a thread only she could see, and behind them the flashlight beams swung and bounced, and the voices shouted directions that the marsh swallowed whole. Rosalind's bare feet hit mud, then water, then the hard-packed sand of the creek path. Amos was silent against her chest, not crying, not making a sound, as though even at 2 years old he understood that silence was survival. Judah's breathing was harsh and rhythmic beside her, Wren's arms locked around his neck, her face buried against his shoulder. "Catch them! Do not let them reach the road!" Boone's voice, now closer than it should have been, ragged with effort and fury. The church appeared out of the darkness, white clapboard catching the faintest ambient light, the steeple, a darker shape against the dark sky. 50 yards. 30. A hand grabbed the back of Rosalind's dress and pulled. She pitched backward, twisting to protect Amos, hitting the ground on her shoulder. The hired man loomed over her, reaching down. Judah materialized from the dark and launched himself at the man's back, all elbows and knees and teeth, a feral, desperate, magnificent fury. The man cursed, releasing Rosalind to deal with the boy clinging to him like a wildcat. Rosalind grabbed a fistful of oyster shell from the path. The Lowcountry ground itself becoming a weapon, and drove it into the man's shin with everything her body had left. He howled, buckled, and Judah rolled free. They reached the church door and hammered on it with both fists. The door opened almost immediately. Reverend Gaines, in his nightclothes, lamp in hand, face creased with sleep and alarm. "They are trying to kill us. The evidence, we have evidence, we need the telephone. The state police." Gaines pulled them inside and through the bolt. The door was oak old and solid, built in a century when churches were expected to withstand more than weather. Behind the altar, there is a room. Gaines was already moving, pushing Odessa and the children toward the back of the sanctuary. "Telephone on the wall. Use it. I will hold the door." The first impact hit before they reached the altar, a shoulder or a boot, something massive driving against the oak. The bolt held. A second impact. A third, wood beginning to splinter along the frame. "Open this door, Gaines." "Boone." His voice had passed beyond anger into something flat and mechanical, like a machine that had been set to a task and would not stop until it was completed or destroyed. "I know they are inside. This has nothing to do with you. Open the door and step aside. This is the house of God, Boone Pemberton, and you will not bring violence into it." Rosalind pushed the children into the small room behind the altar, a vestry barely large enough for all of them, with the telephone mounted on the wall exactly where Gaines had said. Odessa was already lifting the receiver, already dialing, her fingers steady despite the sounds coming from the front of the church wood. Cracking Boone, shouting, Gaines' voice rising in a prayer that was also a command. Rosalind turned back toward the sanctuary. Through the vestry doorway, she could see the front door buckling light from Boone's flashlights cutting through the widening gaps in the frame. She could see Gaines braced against the pew blood on his lip, where a flying splinter had cut him, his lamp casting wild shadows across the walls as the building shook. She stepped out of the vestry and stood in the center aisle. Boone. The door gave way. He filled the frame, breathing hard flashlight in one hand, the other balled into a fist. Behind him, Cyrus and the two hired men. The church interior seemed to shrink around them, the pews and the altar and the cross on the wall, all pulling inward as though the building itself were bracing for what came next. "Here I am." Rosalind's voice was raw from the bruising on her throat, but it did not waver. "Leave the Reverend alone. It is me you want." A terrible smile crossed Boone's face. He began walking toward her, and the flashlight beam moved across the walls in a slow arc, illuminating stained glass and hymnal racks, and the faces of saints frozen in attitudes of mercy. From somewhere behind her, Rosalind heard Odessa speaking rapidly into the telephone, heard the word emergency, heard state police. She needed minutes, only minutes. "You can destroy me, Boone. You can do to me what your great-grandfather did to Clement and what you did to Nate. But it will not matter, because the evidence is already out of your reach. Photographs of every diary Odessa made copies decades ago. Nolan Sykes has given a written statement to someone you will never find. And the original deed is still exactly where Lavinia Beaumont put it 48 years ago, in the creek sealed in iron, waiting for the tide to turn." Boone stopped walking. The smile did not leave his face, but something behind it changed a fracture in the certainty, a crack in the calculation. "Then I suppose none of you can be around to talk about it." He took another step. One of the hired men moved down the side aisle, circling toward the altar. Gaines stepped in front of him and was shoved aside, his body hitting the pew rail with a sound that made Rosalind's stomach drop. The siren split the night open. Red and blue light flooded through the stained glass, transforming the saints into something electric and strange. Tires on gravel, doors slamming, voices carrying the unmistakable authority of men who had arrived with the full weight of the state behind them. Boone's head turned toward the window. The light painted his face in alternating red and blue, and in that strobing illumination Rosalind watched him understand that it was over, not just tonight, but all of it, the entire architecture of lies that 4 generations of Pembertons had built and maintained and killed to protect. It was Cyrus who spoke. He had been standing in the doorway of the church through the entire confrontation, neither inside nor outside, neither with Boone nor against him, occupying the threshold the way he had occupied every moral threshold for his entire life. But now he stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice was steady, in a way Rosalind had never heard from him before. "It is done, Boone. Put your hands up. It is done." Boone turned to look at his brother, and Rosalind saw the moment of recognition, not surprise exactly, but the sick understanding of a man who realizes the betrayal came from the one direction he never thought to guard. "You called them." Their words were barely a whisper. Cyrus said nothing. He did not need to. The state police cruiser that had arrived 4 minutes before Odessa's call was answer enough. Cyrus had placed his own call from the Pemberton house at dusk, before the trucks, before the chase, before any of it, and he had given them everything. The address, the names, the plan his brother had described over the kitchen table, while Cyrus sat and listened, and for the first time in his life decided that silence was no longer something he could afford. Boone raised his hands. The hired men did the same. And as they filed out of the church into the flashing lights, Rosalind sank to her knees on the cold stone floor, not in defeat, but in the kind of exhaustion that comes only after you have held something together long enough for it to hold itself. Judah came from behind the altar. Wren followed. Amos impossibly was asleep in Odessa's arms. The iron key pressed against Rosalind's chest, warming slowly from the heat of her body. Tomorrow she would go to the creek. Tomorrow she would use it to open what had been sealed for nearly half a century. But tonight she held her children and listened to the tide turning in the marsh beyond the church wall, the water rising the way it always rose, slow and patient and impossible to stop. The morning came in soft and gold, the way mornings come to the Lowcountry, when the air is still, and the marsh has spent the night breathing its slow, salt-heavy breath into every corner of the land. Rosalind stood on the steps of the church and watched the light spread across the water tidal creeks, filling with the dawn cordgrass, catching the first color. Egrets lifting from their roosts in long white lines that crossed the sky like sentences being written in a language she was only now learning to read. Boone and the hired men were in the county lockup. The state police had taken them in 2 cruisers and the detective in charge, a woman named Hargrove, mid-50s, with close-cropped gray hair and a handshake that meant business, had listened to Rosalind's account with the focused stillness of someone who recognized the shape of something larger than a single night's violence. "Bring me the physical evidence," Hargrove had said it, standing on the church steps at 2 in the morning, her face lit by the dome light of her cruiser. "Everything you have described, the diaries, the photographs, the original land documents, if they exist and if they prove what you say they prove. Roberto and Antonio," she had caught herself, "Boone and Cyrus Pemberton will not see the outside of a prison for a very long time. They exist." Rosalind had touched the cord around her neck where the key hung. "And there is more, sealed under water for 48 years. I am going to get it today." Hargrove studied her for a long moment. "I will send an officer with you." "No," Rosalind shook her head. "This is something I need to do myself. Lavinia hid it. I am going to be the one who finds it." Now standing in the early light, with Odessa beside her, and the children safe inside the rectory, with Reverend Gaines's housekeeper, Rosalind felt the weight of what lay ahead settle into her bones. Not fear, she had used up her supply of fear. Somewhere between the attic and the church burned through it, the way a lamp burns through its last measure of oil. What she felt instead was gravity, the pull of a thing that needed finishing. Odessa had arranged for a parishioner to drive them to the Pemberton property, or rather to the land that had once been Beaumont land and would soon carry that name again. The truck rattled down the Marsh road in the early quiet passing fields, where the first green shoots of spring rice were pushing through flooded paddies, passing stands of live oak, so old their branches touched the ground on both sides, forming tunnels of green and gray. The tidal creek lay at the back of the property, past the main house, now sealed with police tape, past the equipment sheds and the oyster shucking station and the dock where Nate used to moor the flat-bottomed skiff he used for checking the water levels. The creek itself was wide at this point, perhaps 60 feet across its banks, thick with spartina grass that rippled in the breeze, like something breathing. The water was the color of tea arc with tannin, clear enough in the shallows to see the sandy bottom turning opaque where the depth increased. And there, 20 yards from the bank, rising from the water like something the earth had pushed up through its own skin, was the oyster mound. Not an island exactly, a dense accumulation of shell and sediment that had built up over centuries, high enough at low tide to stand a foot above the waterline, large enough to support a single gnarled cedar and a thicket of wax myrtle. The Beaumont family had called it the Tabby Rise, after the tabby concrete that early settlers had made from burned oyster shell. On its southern face, half submerged even at low tide, a rock formation jutted from the shell matrix, dark angular, split down the center by a fissure that had widened over decades of freeze and thaw. The split gave the rock an unmistakable shape, an anchor, or a heart broken cleanly in two. Rosalind checked the tide chart she had found pinned inside Lavinia's diary. Low tide at 7:42. It was 7:15 now. The water was already retreating, pulling back from the grass in silver threads, exposing mud and shell and the dark, wet roots of things that spent their lives half drowned. She removed her shoes, removed the cotton dress standing in the slip beneath, and untied the leather cord from around her neck. The iron key lay in her palm, black, heavy, warm from her body heat. She closed her fingers around it and felt the teeth press into her skin, each one a small, sharp point of contact between her hand and something that had waited nearly half a century for this exact moment. The water was cold, sharply, shockingly cold, the kind of cold that makes the lungs seize and the skin contract and every nerve in the body send the same urgent message, get out. Rosalind did not get out. She waded forward, the creek bottom shifting from sand to mud to shell beneath her feet, the water rising past her knees, her waist, her chest. The current was gentle but insistent, pulling south towards the Sound, carrying with it the smell of salt and plough mud and the faintly sweet decay of marsh grass breaking down into the soil it had grown from. She reached the Tebby rise and pulled herself onto the shell bank, cutting her palms on the rough edges. The anchor stone was directly ahead, its split face dark with algae, a colony of barnacles clustered along the waterline like a living crust. At the base where stone met shell, she found it scratched into the rock surface, nearly invisible beneath decades of marine growth. A letter, an elaborate B with a small heart carved beneath it. Beaumont. The water around the base of the stone was still waist deep, even at low tide. Rosalind could see the color change pale, where the creek was shallow dark, where it dropped away into the channel that ran alongside the rise. Lavinia's diary had said 3 feet down, 3 feet below the low tide line, directly in front of the anchor stone. She breathed, in and out, slow and deep, the way Nate had taught her years ago when he was showing her how to dive for oysters in the shallows near the dock. Fill the lungs completely, he had said, then let the water take you. It will hold you up if you let it. She filled her lungs, then she went under. The creek water closed over her head, and the world above light air sound vanished, replaced by a muffled green silence. She opened her eyes. The tannin stung, but she could see shafts of morning light penetrating the first few feet, illuminating a landscape of shell and sediment and the slow drift of particles suspended in the current. And there it was, 3 feet below the surface, wedged into a depression at the base of the anchor stone, its outline softened by decades of silt and marine growth, but unmistakably rectangular, unmistakably man-made, an iron chest, smaller than she had imagined, perhaps 2 feet long, a foot wide, crusted with rust and barnacles, and the accumulated weight of 48 years on the bottom of a tidal creek. Her lungs were already tightening. She kicked downward fingers, reaching, and felt metal, cold and rough, beneath the growth. She gripped the handle on one end and pulled. The chest shifted, then held anchored by its own weight and the suction of the mud beneath it. She braced her feet against the stone and pulled again harder, every muscle in her back and arms engaged in a single sustained effort that left no room for anything else. Not thought, not memory, not the burning in her chest that was becoming impossible to ignore. The chest broke free. The sudden release of weight sent her tumbling backward in the water, clutching the handle, kicking toward the surface with a desperation that was entirely animal, the body overriding the mind, demanding air with a ferocity that left no room for negotiation. She broke the surface gasping, coughing, swallowing water, and spitting it out, while her arms refused to release the chest, dragging it through the shallows towards the shell bank where Odessa stood with both hands extended. Together they hauled the chest onto dry shell. Rosalind collapsed beside it, chest-heaving eyes streaming the cord with the key still clenched in her fist. The chest was iron, as Lavinia had written. The lock was iron too, corroded, crusted, but intact, built in a time when locks were made to last by men who understood that some things needed to stay sealed for longer than a single lifetime. Rosalind sat up. She wiped the mud and water from her face with the back of her hand. She fitted the key into the lock. It did not turn. For one terrible suspended moment, a moment in which 48 years of patience and 9 months of grief and 4 days of courage seemed to teeter on the edge of something as small and as absolute as a quarter-inch of rusted iron, the key would not turn. Then Rosalind felt it give. A fraction of a millimeter at first, then more, the mechanism inside the lock yielding with a grinding reluctance, as though the chest itself needed to be convinced that the time had truly come. She pressed harder, the key turned, the lock released with a sound like a bone, cracking sharp, final, irreversible. She lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had done its job with remarkable fidelity, was a packet. The oilcloth had kept the water out, not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough that when Rosalind unwrapped it with hands that shook from cold and adrenaline, and something much larger than either the documents inside were legible, damaged at the edges, stained where moisture had seeped through, but legible. The original deed to 600 acres of Lowcountry land, dated 1868, bearing the name of Charles Beaumont and the seal of Beaufort County, transferred documents showing the land passing to Lavinia Beaumont upon her father's death. The forged gambling debts Lavinia had annotated every inconsistency in her precise, furious hand-circling dates that did not match signatures that bore no resemblance to Clement's actual writing witnesses whose names appeared in no county record. Letters between Horace Pemberton and Jasper Beaumont, written in the casual tone of men discussing a business arrangement rather than a murder and a theft, and at the bottom of the stack, sealed in its own oilcloth envelope, a will. Lavinia's will dated 2 weeks before her death, declaring that the Beaumont land and all rights pertaining to it should pass to her daughter Eudora and to Eudora's descendants in perpetuity. Attached to the will in Lavinia's hand was a genealogy. Rosalind traced the lines with a finger that left wet marks on the old paper. Lavinia Beaumont married Clement Marsh, their daughter Eudora. Eudora married Thomas Collier, their daughter Frances. Frances married Henry Santos, their daughter Rosalind, her own name, written in the hand of a woman who died 20 years before Rosalind was born, placed inside an iron chest, sealed with a key, and buried in a tidal creek, where it waited through 2 generations for the granddaughter who would dive down and bring it back to the surface. Odessa was weeping, not the quiet tears of relief, but the open, unguarded weeping of someone who had carried a weight for so long that the act of setting it down was itself a kind of violence, a breaking open that hurt even as it healed. She knew. Odessa's voice came in pieces between breath. Lavinia knew someone would come. She wrote your name into the future before you existed, and the water kept it safe until you were ready. Detective Hargrove arrived within the hour. She examined each document with the methodical attention of someone who understood that what she was holding would rewrite the property records of an entire county. She spent 40 minutes reading, comparing, verifying. Then she looked up at Rosalind and said 2 sentences. This goes directly to the circuit court. With this evidence, the Pemberton claim collapses entirely. What Hargrove did not yet know, what no one knew until that afternoon, was that Cyrus Pemberton had already walked into the state police barracks in Beaufort and placed 2 objects on the desk of the duty officer. The first was the pair of stolen diaries, unburned the covers, still smelling of the smoke from the fireplace, where Boone had tried to destroy them before Cyrus pulled them out. The second was a handwritten statement 4 pages long, describing in detail the events of the night Nate Pemberton died. I did not hold the pole, the last paragraph read, but I stood there. I watched my brother put it against Nate's chest and push him under the water, and I did not move. I did not call for help. I did not pull Nate out. When it was over, I turned my back and walked away, and I have been walking away from that night every day since. I am done walking away. I did not hold the pole. But not holding it is not the same as being innocent. The trial took 3 months. The evidence was so comprehensive, spanning a century of documentation, corroborated by living testimony, physical proof, and Cyrus's own confession, that Boone's attorneys requested 4 separate continuances, each one a smaller and more desperate attempt to delay an outcome everyone in the courtroom already knew. Boone Pemberton was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of Nate Pemberton, attempted murder of Rosalind Pemberton, attempted arson, and aggravated assault. 30 years without the possibility of parole. He stood motionless when the sentence was read, staring at a point on the wall behind the judge's head, his face showing nothing. A man who had spent his entire life calculating and had finally reached a number he could not reduce. Cyrus Pemberton pleaded guilty to accessory after the fact and criminal conspiracy. 5 years reduced for cooperation. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, Cyrus turned in his chair and looked directly at Rosalind. He did not speak. He did not need to. The look carried everything remorse and exhaustion, and the smallest, most tentative suggestion of something that might, over the course of 5 years in a cell, with nothing to do but think, grow into something resembling accountability. The court formally recognized Rosalind Santos Pemberton as the direct descendant of Lavinia Beaumont and the legitimate heir to the Whitfield estate. 600 acres of Lowcountry marsh farmland and tidal frontage transferred by order of the Circuit Court of Beaufort County to the woman who had walked barefoot down a dirt road 9 months ago with $4.75 and 3 children who had not eaten in 2 days. 6 months passed. The light in the kitchen of Whitfield House was different now. Not the gray, filtered light of a building slowly being consumed by its own decay, but the warm, steady light of a house that had remembered what it was for. The walls had been replastered and painted the pale blue that Lavinia had chosen in 1892. Rosalind had found the color described in one of the early diaries and matched it as closely as she could. The cast-iron stove had been restored, not replaced, its surface oiled and seasoned until it gleamed like something alive. The pantry shelves held rice and dried shrimp and jars of fig preserves that Odessa had put up in September, and the kitchen table, the same table where Odessa had placed bread and coffee that first morning, now bore the marks of daily use, the scratches and water rings of a surface that had people sitting around it 3 times a day. Rosalind stood at the sink, washing the last of the supper dishes, looking through the window at the evening settling over the marsh. The tide was coming in. She could see it in the way the light moved on the water, the creeks filling the grass, beginning to sway as the current pushed through the surface, catching the last copper-colored light of the sun and holding it. Wren was in the yard barefoot and brown-legged, chasing fireflies with a mason jar. Her laughter came through the open window in bright, irregular bursts, the laughter of a child who has forgotten that she once asked if there was food, because food is now something that simply exists 3 times a day without question or fear. Amos sat on the porch steps, stacking shells into towers and knocking them down with the serious concentration of a boy whose cheeks had filled out and whose eyes had cleared and whose body had finally been given what it needed to do what 2-year-old bodies are supposed to do: grow. Nolan Sykes and his wife Bet had moved into the renovated cottage at the south end of the property, not as tenants, not as hired hands, as partners. Nolan managing the oyster beds and the rice paddies, sharing in the profits of land that was producing again after years of neglect under Boone's careless stewardship. Bet had become the person Rosalind called when she did not know whether the soil was right or the planting was late, or the storm that was building over the sound would pass or stay. They had supper together most Sundays, a long table on the porch Odessa, at the head presiding over platters of shrimp and grits and cornbread with the quiet authority of a woman who had waited half a century to cook in this kitchen again and intended to make every meal count. A sound from the front of the house pulled Rosalind from the window. She dried her hands and walked through the parlor, restored now the sheet-covered furniture, replaced with pieces that respected the house's age without pretending to be antiques. Lavinia's portrait hung above the fireplace, found in the attic, cleaned and reframed. The face in the painting was young, no older than Rosalind was now, with dark eyes that held the particular combination of intelligence and stubbornness that Rosalind recognized from her own mirror. Judah was in the front garden, standing beside something new. He had spent the last 2 months working on it, cutting and sanding the wood himself, carving the letters with a chisel he had borrowed from Nolan, fitting the pieces together with the concentration of someone building a thing that needed to last. A marker, simple cypress, shaped into a cross, sealed against the salt air, set into a bed of marsh marigolds that Judah had transplanted from the creek bank, the carved letters read. Nate Pemberton, husband, father, the one who went looking for the truth, 1934 to 1971. Rosalind stood beside her son and read the words and did not try to stop the tears, because some tears are not weakness. Some tears are the body's way of acknowledging that a thing has been completed, that a circle which opened in pain has closed in something that, if it is not peace, is at least the ground on which peace might eventually be built. He would have been proud of you. Judah's voice had changed in the past month's deeper, steadier, carrying the weight of the year, the way a young tree carries the weight of its first heavy fruit. Not because of what you found, because you did not stop. Rosalind put her arm around his shoulders. She had to reach up slightly now, the boy having grown 3 inches since spring, and they stood together in the garden, while the light went from gold to amber to the deep, unrepeatable blue that lives for only a few seconds at the boundary between day and night. Later, after the children were asleep, Wren, in her room with the quilt Odessa had sewn from scraps of fabric found in the attic, Amos in his crib, beneath the window, where the sound of the creek at high tide would lull him through until morning. Rosalind climbed the stairs to the attic. Lavinia's diaries stood in their row on the mahogany desk, restored to their proper order. The 2 that Boone had stolen and Cyrus had returned occupied their rightful places in the sequence, the covers slightly warped from their time near the fire, but intact. Beside them, Rosalind placed something new, a blank journal, leather-bound, purchased from a stationer in Beaufort, with money earned from the first oyster harvest. She sat at the desk, opened the journal, and picked up a pen. October 12th, 1971. My name is Rosalind Santos Pemberton. I am the great-granddaughter of Lavinia Beaumont, and I am writing so that one day my children and their children will know where they came from and what it cost to bring them here. She wrote about Lavinia, about Clement, about the forged documents and the drowning in the creek, and the iron chest sealed with a key and buried in the tidal mud. She wrote about Nate, about the man he was, and the truth he found, and the price he paid for believing that honesty could survive in a world built on theft. She wrote about Odessa, who held a secret for 48 years and never once let it go. About Judah, who swung a candlestick at a man twice his size, because some things are worth defending even when you are too young to know the word for what you are defending. About Wren, who walked on a bleeding foot without complaint. About Amos, who survived. And she wrote about Cyrus, the brother who did not hold the pole, but did not pull Nate out, who stood on the threshold between complicity and conscience for 9 months before finally stepping through, because the story was not complete without him, because justice that acknowledges the full complexity of human failure is more durable than justice that divides the world cleanly into heroes and monsters. When she finished writing, Rosalind closed the journal and placed it on the shelf beside Lavinia's diaries, the new beside the old, the continuation beside the origin, the proof that some stories do not end when their authors die, but simply wait for the next voice to pick them up. She descended the stairs and walked to the entrance hall. The fireplace mantel had been cleaned and oiled, the carved egrets and marsh reeds visible again after decades of grime. And there on the iron nail where she had found it that first evening, the evening she had walked into this house with nothing but 3 children and the blind, stubborn refusal to lie down and die, hung the key. Rosalind lifted it from the nail, held it in her palm, felt its weight, the weight of iron, the weight of years, the weight of everything it had opened. Then she hung it back. Not because it was finished with, not because it no longer mattered, but because some things belong where they are fixed, visible, a reminder to anyone who walks through the door that this house was locked once, and someone came and opened it, and the truth that was sealed inside changed everything. She stepped onto the porch. The night was warm and thick with the sound of crickets and tree frogs and the slow rhythmic movement of water through grass. The tide was at its highest now, the creek full. The marsh flooded the whole Lowcountry landscape, transformed into a mirror that reflected the stars back at themselves. Odessa was already there, sitting in the rocker that Nolan had built for her, a cup of tea cooling on the rail beside her. Still feels like a dream sometimes. Rosalind leaned against the porch column and looked out at the water, like I am going to wake up and be back on that kitchen floor. Odessa rocked slowly, the chair creaking in a rhythm that matched the tide. It is not a dream, it is the thing that happens when someone decides the truth matters more than safety. Lavinia decided it. Nate decided it. You decided it. And the water kept its promise. They sat together in the dark, listening to the marsh, and neither of them spoke for a long time, because there are silences that are not empty silences, that are full of everything that has been said and survived and built. Silences that hold more meaning than words can carry. The tide reached its peak. For one suspended moment, the water held perfectly still, neither rising nor falling, neither coming nor going, balanced at the top of its arc, holding everything. Then it turned, the way it always turns. The way it turned the night Lavinia buried the chest and trusted the creek to keep it safe. The way it turned the night Nate died, and the truth sank beneath the surface and waited. The way it turned the morning Rosalind dove into the cold water and brought it back, slow, patient, impossible to hold back. If this story stayed with you, take a moment now to subscribe and leave a comment below. Tell me, has there ever been a time in your life when the truth was buried, when everyone around you said to leave it alone, to let it stay where it was, and did you dig it up anyway, or do you wish you had